How's it going, everybody? Thank you for being here. My name is Antonio, and you're about to watch or listen to a conversation that is general and impersonal in nature. It is one that will contain speculations about future events and forward-looking statements, and one that will constitute no financial nor investment advice whatsoever. That all said, today I'm talking to an ex-renewable energy supporter turned nuke bro turned fossil fuels shill who is allegedly sponsored by the big bad oil and gas wolves in Europe to spread dangerous facts about our energy system on Twitter, at least if you can believe the comments. Brian Gitt, thank you for sitting down with me, sir.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Sorry, I'm hearing a little background noise, so if let me know if it's creating any problems for you.
No, I can't really hear anything, so it should be fine. Did I miss something in your description there based on your Twitter comments?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. Yeah, I mean, during the day, my day job is I'm head of business development for Oklo, and we build small modular nuclear power reactors and operate them and sell 24/7 clean power. But in my heart, I'm pro energy and pro human, and I'm basically wanting to spread the word that the world needs more energy, and that includes all types of fossil fuels, it includes nuclear power, and I want to do anything I can to kind of spread that message and change the energy narrative.
Oh, so you don't think that we should just have 50% less people? I thought that was an easy, solution.
It
Yeah.
doesn't sound like a very friendly approach.
No, it's true. It's true. All jokes aside, though, Brian, I wanted to talk about the energy crisis today. Actually, maybe we can just take it all the way from the top, and you can explain it to me like in five. What's going on with our energy? Are we actually in a crisis? Is it just Europe? Is the whole world? Tell me what you know.
There's 101 countries around the world right now that are facing civil unrest due to exorbitant energy prices or energy scarcity. So I would say yes, we are definitely in an energy crisis if you have that level of political turmoil happening throughout the world. Unfortunately, it is disproportionately impacting developing countries because they don't obviously have the wealth and resources to kind of buffer these kinds of scarcity situations. So in general, the world is short because we haven't been investing in the necessary supply, right? I mean, for the last close to a decade, last 5 to 10 years, the world has been on this mission to transition to renewable energy and starting to divest from fossil fuels. At least that was what was communicated by government and even the large super major oil companies. And so what we've seen is this lack of investment in the supply side. And that only can go on so long. I mean, we're structurally undersupplied. And at a certain point, unless demand is going to change, which clearly it's not, we're going to be using a lot more energy, not less, as we move forward. I mean, the projections are we're going to use about 50% more global energy by 2050 than we are today,
Mm.
right? And most of that is going to be in developing countries such as China and parts of Southeast Asia, et cetera. So we're going to need a lot more energy. We're structurally short right now because we haven't been making the appropriate investments. And this is kind of all coming to a head. And this is creating this chaos and political turmoil, spikes in spot prices, et cetera.
Hmm. Who do you think is to blame here? Is it governments who didn't ensure energy independence before that? Is it the big bad wolf in Eastern Europe? What do you think?
Well, energy is complicated, especially when we're talking about global energy markets. And there's really several converging trends and confounding factors that are leading to this. Absolutely, the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion is having an impact. And you can't, in any possible scenario, pretend that that's not happening. But this structural undersupply was very much the case well before that incursion ever took place. So, although Russia's invasion was a catalyst to exacerbate the problem, make it worse, it certainly wasn't the cause of the problem. So that's one trend that we're dealing with, and there's a lot of uncertainty when you have war on the brink, as we do right now. We have, in addition, we've had this divestment from nuclear power in Europe specifically and this is going way back over the last several decades, actually. There's been this march and drumbeat to ultimately phase down nuclear power. And as that has happened, unfortunately, that has mostly been promoted by a lot of the environmental green activist organizations. And that has influenced government. And government has taken these initiatives very seriously. And even in countries like France, where France used to be the poster child for nuclear power, right? They invested for energy security reasons in the 70s and 80s. They built up in really a short period of time, in 15 years, they built over 50 nuclear power reactors, and they're generating 70% of their electricity from nuclear, which is an incredible achievement. I mean, they deserve tremendous respect for that level of foresight and investment. However, time does gnaw on these things. You have to maintain these fleets. And unfortunately, in 2015, the French government enacted an energy transition plan to start to divest from nuclear and focus more on renewable energy. All right. And so when you realize that the trajectory of this nuclear fleet is going to be declining and the money, new investment, is going into renewables, obviously it's human nature. The incentives are such that you're going to start divesting in terms of deferring maintenance, kicking the can down the road. You're certainly not going to be building new plants. And what's happened is over the course of time, this amazing nuclear fleet has not been adequately maintained to the level it should. And therefore, you're starting to see capacity factors drop off. All that means is the amount of time that the nuclear plant is generating the maximum amount of energy. And so you're starting to see even the leader in nuclear power in Europe starting to buckle and face this unfortunate energy transition narrative and feel the effects of that. So that was another confounding factor, is divestment from nuclear. The fracking bans. So Europe, many countries in Europe banned fracking for natural gas. Well, there's plenty of natural gas in parts of Europe, especially in the UK, North Sea, even Germany has some. So there's no reason they had to do this, but they made this unilateral decision that they were banning fracking and that they were going to import cheap natural gas from Russia, which, just stepping back and zooming out and thinking about this for a second, this seems ludicrous to me, that you're going to use natural gas, but you're just going to import it from an adversarial country versus investing in developing those natural gas resources at home and putting people to work in creating energy security. So that seemed like a pretty bad decision and an obvious blunder. So all I'm trying to point out here is there's multiple factors that have caused this current crisis. And then one of the other large ones is this almost single-minded focus on solar and wind power, and that this energy transition plan that many European countries and other countries around the world have embraced, Germany being the perfect example of this, obviously investing almost €500 billion over 20 years to build a redundant grid. And now 90% of all of their fossil-fired infrastructure they had to keep. They couldn't get rid of it because, as we know, intermittent power doesn't replace power plants. And therefore, a huge amount of money went into this investment. And yet it's not being able to deliver when Germany needs it most and when Europe needs it most. So all of these factors contributed to the current crisis. It's not just a single item.
It sounds to me like this has been many years in the making. So if you were some sort of a serious politician focusing on energy, this should not come off as a surprise. Yet it seems when you watch the news as if this has come just out of nowhere. Nobody expected there to be any energy issues whatsoever, even the people who were making choices for our energy future. If we were to put this on some sort of a timeline, though, or just imagine that we're already in the future and we are reading about this crisis in the history books, do you think 2022 will fall more towards the beginning or the end of the crisis?
Oh, I think we're in the very early days We have a structural supply issue that's going to take likely the remainder of the 2020s to fix. And that's assuming that we're going to jump in and actually start investing in development of hydrocarbons, which is absolutely required to overcome this crisis. What we see in reality is a lot of these countries are doubling down on the very policies that led us into this mess in the first place, right? You see Germany kicking and screaming, doing everything it can to not even bring to not shut down these three last nuclear power plants. I mean, the fact that you would even consider shutting down a nuclear power plant when you're in an energy crisis makes no sense whatsoever, unless there was some imminent danger or threat, which is not the case. This is just by policy. So they're still continuing this same bad policy and bad energy strategy of they're doubling down on renewables. They're saying that's what's going to solve this problem. Luckily, in the UK, we've seen a lifting of the fracking ban there, but we haven't seen that across Europe, right? So we haven't seen all these countries scrambling and saying, okay, we're going to produce our energy locally. We're going to release these bans. And even in the UK, which is a great trend, right? I'm glad that this happened, that they lifted the ban, but this is going to take years to actually develop the infrastructure. It's not just the policy barrier. You have a huge labor shortage. You have the actual tools and technology and supply chain issues to get all of that industry stood up in enough time to actually start pulling gas out of the ground. You're looking at a couple years or so even to get going, right? So these things don't just happen overnight. It's not just flipping a light switch. It's really going to take a lot of sustained investment in the development of hydrocarbons, in building the liquefied natural gas import facilities, which they have started in Germany and in other places, so that you can actually import the LNG as you need it. But those take 2 to 3+ years to make, right, and to build them out. So all of these things, and certainly nuclear, it takes a long time to build. That's not going to solve the problem overnight. Even with small advanced reactors, that's not going to be able to be turned on in the next couple of years. So I really see for the remainder of this decade, it's highly likely that we're going to be in a structural supply shortage for energy, which means we're going to have pretty consistent high prices. Now, obviously, there's other macro forces at work here. We have the economy, and we have a softening of the economy right now, and because of inflation, because of monetary tightening, et cetera. So there's many various currents at play. And so we're going to see it's not going to just go in one direction or another. We're going to see it chop along, going up and down. There's going to be a lot of volatility likely in the market. And this is going to continue I would foresee, quite a few years until we get the necessary investment.
I want to go further with that and sort of imagine what the crisis will look like going forward. But just to elaborate on one of the points that you made there, on fake proclaimed environmentalists might make the case that Germany had to shut down those nuclear power plants because they've already gotten to an age where they're no longer safe to operate. Now, I know that's not true, but can you maybe tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. No, these plants are safe to operate. I mean, most nuclear plants are licensed on 40-year intervals, and it's anticipated that they will extend the license. They'll go through kind of the regulatory process and have the appropriate checks and quality assurance and making sure that they're safe. But then they get relicensed, and those typically get extended. The reason the German plants are getting shut down is purely a policy-driven belief that they wanted to divest from nuclear power, because nuclear power plants, if they're well maintained, can last 80 to 100 years. There's no reason they can't. I mean, you're basically refurbishing them. You have to replace key parts and components, but the core plant should be able to last for up to a century. So no, there's no physical reason why these have to be shut down at this time.
Nuclear power plants sound a little bit like one of my first cars, which was a diesel Volkswagen Golf that you can just change some little things over time and it'll keep running forever. Let's talk about the energy crisis and how you see it going forward, though. Do you think it will get worse from here? Like, do you think we're gonna be seeing like rolling blackouts and cold winters as they're saying in the news?
Well, some of this is going to be dependent on the weather, right? So this is kind of a sad state of affairs that in one of the wealthiest areas of the world, Europe, and specifically Germany, we're wondering whether people are going to freeze to death in their homes if it's cold or not, right? I mean, that's kind of silly given our level of technology and kind of modern infrastructure that we have that we're even having this conversation about it. But it's really going to come down to how cold this winter is. I'm really happy to see that Europe in general has filled their gas reserve, their gas storage, right? So they're going into the winter, at least I think they're almost up to 90% of their storage capacity, which is great news. It's good to hear. They've had to pay a premium for that because they've been buying this very expensive gas to fill it, and therefore we've seen prices just soar and skyrocket, and that's why they're starting to put in place these various price controls and other mechanisms to protect consumers, and that's why we're seeing the deindustrialization of industry. However, it's good news that there's storage. However, we're already starting to see that if we get colder weather than normal, um, Europe is in big trouble, right? There isn't anywhere to go once those storage reserves start running empty. And now, what the looks like, at least the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2, which are the main gas pipelines that would get to Europe from Russia, outside of going through Ukraine, those weren't actually distributing gas right now. Nord Stream 2 never actually started, but it was there. And they could they could turn it on. And Nord Stream 1, they had already shut it down. However, the reality that this is no longer an option, that this is a strategy that's been taken off the table, I think really is saying a lot in terms of where Europe is at in terms of their options. It's reducing optionality now that these things are off the table. So I think it is significant in the overall scheme of this situation.
What is it gonna look like though if there's not enough gas, if there's not enough energy? Like, are we gonna see energy lockdowns, or like, are we gonna shut down the economy? Take care. What do you think is gonna look like? I just can't imagine it.
Well, we're already starting to see it happen right now, and you're seeing energy rationing in certain types of buildings and in certain types of industries. You're seeing, for example, in multifamily buildings in parts of Germany right now, they're being told when they can take hot showers. The central amenities are, they're not using certain centralized lighting in the evenings. Swimming pools at universities aren't being heated. There's a lot of rationing that's already happening today. Most importantly, though, is the industrial sector, because that's who's going to get hit the hardest with this. Whether you're talking about aluminum or steel smelters or glass factories, there's a lot of energy intensive industry, specifically in Germany, because it's kind of the heart of industrial Europe. And those industries are just getting devastated already. What we've seen is a significant reduction. I think it's 50% loss of, let's say, aluminum production, from where we were just a couple of years ago. So we're already seeing it today, but it will continue to increase, and the gravity of it and the ripple effects will continue to get more severe as we head into winter, because ultimately the government cannot afford to have chaos and people basically starting to go out in the streets and protest and riot. So what they're going to do is, first they're going to target industry, and they're going to basically enforce various rationing or stop the flow altogether. So that means the fertilizer companies and these various smelters and glass factories will be forced to close, or in even more restrictive fashion than they are today. But what we're going to see is that someone's got to pay for all this, right? I mean, luckily, countries like France and Germany and others in Europe are wealthy countries in contrast to many other parts of the world, and they have a tax base that can help subsidize this. And that's really what the price controls are all about. If you're going to cap the price of energy that a home owner or renter is going to pay, Well, someone ultimately has to pay for that. It's not like it's free energy just falling from the sky. And ultimately, it's going to be put on the back of the taxpayer to pay it. Now, that's one thing. You can do that for a period of time, but as you drain those tax resources, things are going to get a lot nastier, right? Just from the political standpoint. And many countries around the world don't have that luxury. It's really a shame that energy policy in Europe really has a greater impact in other developing countries, let's say like Bangladesh or other parts of Asia. So the reality is that those countries are going to have severe energy restrictions. They're not going, or and the prices are skyrocketing because basically Europe is paying a premium to get all of the LNG shipped to them, right? And so it's not getting to the other places. And these fertilizer shortages are going to have a huge spillover effect when, especially come planting season in the spring, when we don't have the crops. Well, who's going to suffer the most? It's going to be the poor people in developing countries that aren't going to be able to access food, or the price is going to be so astronomical they won't be able to afford it. So Europe, a lot of people are going to suffer in Europe. There's no doubt about it. But the real suffering, the real hardship is going to be on the backs of the developing world because of bad decisions in Europe.
I'm thinking about how we come out of this too, because as you mentioned, we are seeing what they're now calling deindustrialization, something like those lines. And it's actually quite preposterous. I watched an interview, I don't remember what, some German media, whatever, on YouTube sent it out. Was an interview with one of the ladies at Bruegel. It's they call it an economic think tank out of Brussels, and she was talking about deindustrialization of the economy and how everything is going to be fine because we're going to go to a digital economy. And, all those heavy industries that, by the way, right now, they comprise over a fifth of the GDP of Europe's largest economic power, which is Germany. She's like, we're not going to go back to those heavy industries after this energy rationing. We're just going to go into a digital economy and it's going to be okay, which sounds like quite comparable to the utopian dream of wind and free wind and free sun energy as they were promised before that. But if you combine that deindustrialization of the economy with the fact that they're trying to implement price caps that are later going to have to be paid back by the people who normally work in the industry, you're creating some kind of a mess that might be an even worse mess in like 10 years. Don't you think? What do you think about that?
The deindustrialization issue is real, but everything in her life, or everything in all of our lives, revolves around energy, right? Everything from your laptop to your coffee in the morning, to your phone, to lights, everything. And these are real molecules that had to be dug out of the ground, and burned and transformed into useful items that serve us. And so there's no amount, I mean, I'm all pro digitization and technology, but there's no scenario where we are divesting from these core industries such as mining and energy and kind of heavy manufacturing. I mean, these are the industries that fuel modern life, and there's no way around it. I mean, where do they think solar panels are made, or wind turbines? These things are made out of fossil fuels, toxic chemicals, and minerals. I mean, that is the core ingredients in those renewable energy sources. So there isn't a scenario in any realm of reason that somehow divest from these things. What will happen though is basically people will get poorer, right? Their quality of life will decrease. They won't have the same quality of food. They won't have the same quality of comfort. They won't. The prices of things will go much higher, and these are going to be um, real implications for that. I think a lot of people, it's not top of mind yet because it hasn't hit them, but it's
Mm.
coming. And if we don't course correct and make some better decisions, people's quality of life is going to start to erode.
It could be just me, but I have a feeling that from having discussions about solar, wind, and nuclear on Twitter, the people who actually root for us to become poorer, to actually use less, are often the people who support solar and wind for some reason. And I don't mean to bash necessarily in solar or and wind or whatever, but it's just I just don't understand the idea of consume less. Um, I don't know. I just don't see it happening. And in
There's
terms of
a
energy.
there's a degrowth mindset of some uh, there's a strain of environmentalism that has this degrowth mindset that there's too many humans, their humans are bad, that unless we decrease the number of humans, we're basically a cancer on the earth and we're using up all the materials, we're cutting down all the forest, and we're basically consuming everything. And it's just wrong, first of all, because almost every environmental metric has been improving as we've learned to harness more energy and we've protected our forest. We have more forest today than we had, a couple hundred years ago. The air quality is getting better. The water quality is getting better. Technology and civilization improves the environment. It's just quite the opposite impact. But unfortunately, this strain of degrowth environmentalism has percolated into our politics to some degree too. And it's kind of scary because we have what, like it or not, there's 7+ billion people on the planet, and what do you want to do? Just you're gonna who wants to go first, right? I mean, I would suggest that if they have this personal philosophy, that maybe they volunteer.
Hmm, hmm. That's that's a fair point. Checkmate. But what about nationalization of energy, maybe? And well, kind of what we're seeing from France right now, right? They bought the remaining 16 or 15% or something of EDF, their nuclear operator, their nuclear arm, basically. So they owned a lot of it already, but the group came out with dozens of billions in projected losses. And France said, "We're going to buy you up. We're not going to focus on profit, but we're going to focus on delivering energy." Could that be a potential solution to the energy issue? Is that adding to the problem? What do you think?
I think it depends on the time frame that we're talking about. In short term, governments are going to do whatever they need to do to survive and not have chaos and destruction reigning throughout the streets. They don't want to have protests and riots. And they know that if people's bills go up 1,000% and people can't stay warm in the winter, that the politicians are going to be ousted, right? And so there is kind of this short-term emergency that needs to be dealt with. And if you have a large utility or major industry going bankrupt overnight, that threatens the stability of the culture. So there's, from a short-term standpoint, sometimes these kinds of measures are necessary, but they're not going to solve the problem. And ultimately, I'm of the view that if you're going to centralize more and more of this decision making at the governmental level, you're ultimately going to get less innovation. You're going to get less of the market signals that are necessary for the prices. I mean, the reason why price controls are so dangerous is not because of course, you don't want your average family paying 10x the price for energy next week when it's cold outside and they're freezing. Obviously, the problem is you're basically disguising the market signal, and you're sending the wrong signal, because what you need to be doing is sending the signal that energy is really expensive. We need to go produce more, right? You need to tell companies, hey, energy companies, you need to go out and produce more energy because we need a lot more, and that's why the price is so high. But we're actually sending the exact opposite message. If you're an energy company and you're going to get taxed, your profits are going to be taxed more, and the price of the product is going to be capped. Where's the incentive for them to go develop more? That doesn't even, it's not aligning the correct incentives to drive more supply, which will drive down the cost. So you're blocking the very solution that is going to help solve the problem, right? And so this is where I get concerned about centralized decision making within government bodies, is that they're more focused on the short-term emergency, which sometimes are necessary, but they're lacking the longer term view and better judgment of how these decisions are going to actually solve or not solve the problem to begin with.
Being focused on the short-term emergency seems like it almost seems like you can see that across many different industries. We can even start talking about electric vehicles. For example, I had my I had my first and possibly last, but experience with a with an electric vehicle was very bad with a Tesla Model 3 in the winter of 2020. It was that was before the energy crisis had started. I was already paying more to charge it, to run it per kilometer per mile. I was charging it on a V2 supercharger than what I was paying for that diesel powered Volkswagen Golf that I told you about before that. But now with the energy crisis, I imagine it's gotten even worse to charge electric vehicles. And you've also been sharing some interesting information about that on Twitter, by the way. But it seems like a lot of people don't agree with you, or maybe don't understand what you really mean. And a lot of them think that those vehicles will somehow help make us less dependent on fossil fuels. They will help make that transition from ICE vehicles to EVs, and thus lower that dependency on fossil fuels. But you don't agree with that, I guess. So maybe you can talk to me a little bit about that as well.
I'm not anti-electric vehicle. I'm not anti any technology. Ultimately, it's about the value that they can provide. And maybe electric vehicles will get there eventually. Sometimes technologies take time to evolve, but ultimately, a technology has to be better than the thing that they're replacing for it to get mainstream adoption, right? And when you look at charging time, when you look at range, when you look at cost, when you look at all of these key evaluation metrics, it's not anywhere close yet, right? And great, if you want to buy an electric vehicle, you should have the freedom and luxury to do that. I don't want to stop people from buying electric vehicles, but that's very different than creating laws and mandates that such as California, New York, and parts of Europe, where they're saying zero gasoline powered vehicles will be allowed to be sold by 2035 in the case of California and New York. That's incredibly dangerous and an incredibly regressive tax on lower and middle income people, because electric vehicles, the average cost today, average, is about $66,000, right? That's a luxury vehicle.
Yeah.
That's about double the cost of what kind of a conventional mid-sized sedan would cost. So who is buying these vehicles? We know they've done the market research and the surveys. You're talking about people that are making six-figure salaries that are higher on the economic spectrum. And they're not living paycheck to paycheck and worrying about their gas money or they're paying for their electric bill. These people are more well off, and hey, they should have the right to buy electric vehicles if they want. It should be, you should have that freedom. But the reality is, when you start imposing these government mandates, now you've left the realm of free choice, and now you're imposing a regressive tax on lower income people, which I think is just a terrible way to implement policy. And ultimately, we're not actually solving the core problem, because what these policies, what's behind them is what you mentioned, which is climate risk. That is the genesis or the momentum that people are pushing these policies. But if that's your number one concern, climate is a concern, climate change is a concern. But if that is your number one concern, pushing electric vehicle policies are one of the least cost effective ways that you could possibly solve the problem. There are
Mhm.
many much more effective ways to reduce CO2 emissions than electric vehicles. They are just an incredibly expensive approach. So that's where I have the problem, is that it's just the alignment between the goal and the solution are out of lockstep. And unfortunately, it's going on the back of lower income people. So that's where my concern is. We just say in the UK, I was just reading an article this last week that now, because of the spikes in the cost of electricity, to charge an electric vehicle at a public charging station is basically on par with a gasoline fired car or fired engine. So, and that's now, right? We're going to see electricity prices go up higher based upon all of the structural supply issues we talked earlier. They're basically up 42%. The cost of charging at a public rapid charger in the UK just since May of this year. So not in such a long period of time. So the cost is not only in the operational cost, but that huge price tag that is not going to necessarily be paid back in value over time.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about what happened to me. I'm not among, and in 2021 was even further from being among the top earners, and people who can afford luxury vehicles. How I was tricked into, well, first of all, it's a fair disclaimer. I'm kind of retarded, but how I was tricked into buying it was that my Volkswagen Golf, it was a diesel powered vehicle, as I mentioned a couple of times. There's these low emission zones that they implemented around large Belgian cities. And so I, starting, what is it, 2024 or something, I would not have been able to go into a city unless you buy a vignette, I guess is what you call it, whatever. You buy a sticker, you can enter there, whatever. It raises your cost of going into a city. And then eventually they were talking about banning all diesel vehicles out of the cities and stuff like that. So I spoke to my accountant, then I spoke to my bank. My bank got me a 0% loan for that electric vehicle. Even after that loan, by the way, I got rid of the car in, I want to say 8 or 9 days, something along those lines, because I was just late to return it because Tesla still had that policy where you can return the vehicle within 7 days. But I was just late a couple of days on it. So I booked a massive loss on it. Even booking the massive loss, it was still worth it. It was still worth it to get rid of the car now instead of run it for 5 years. Because when you account for depreciation as well, Teslas are a lot like iPhones, for example. In 5 years, they're going to be new models. The other ones are going to have depreciated, even though they get software updates. They don't get the hardware updates. And you calculate for the hours that you spend on the V2 supercharger and all these things, and it didn't make sense for me. Yet I was sold on the idea, even though I ran the basic calculations, I was still sold on the idea. So I can imagine this happens to more people out there.
I mean, Teslas are great cars. I mean, they're fun to drive and they aesthetically are good-looking cars.
Yeah.
But it's important to be honest about what the trade-offs are. And yeah, if you live in a home where you have a garage and you have cheap power and you can plug your Tesla in your garage, and you don't plan to go on road trips, extensive road trips, and you're using it mostly to go around town and commute, then great, and you get the benefit of the various subsidies and rebates. It makes a lot of sense, right? But you have to realize that that's a very small number of people that are in that
Yeah.
situation. Most people don't have their own dedicated garage where they can charge their vehicle. You know,
Mm.
they live in urban areas where how are you going to charge it? You're relying on this public charging infrastructure. There was a study, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there was a study that was done of existing public charging stations when they went around and actually tested them to see if they actually worked. About 25% of them weren't working for a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes it was the screen wasn't working. Sometimes it was the card reader. Sometimes, the actual handle or component was broken. There's a variety of reasons why, but still, it's like 25% of the chargers weren't working for some reason. And this is a state that has invested more in public charging than almost any other in the U.S., right? And we're not talking about decades ago. These are relatively recent over the last several years. So I mean, I don't know that this inconvenience and in cost factor are really being considered. It's being all driven by ideological policy that unfortunately is not even going to meet the aim of the policy.
I agree. I experienced pretty much the same thing in that horrible week that I had with it. When I called up Tesla and I told them stuff like, I'm on a V2 supercharger, the car is charging at like 3 to 6 kilowatts an hour. It's going really slow. They accused me of being stupid. So I agree with them, and then I sold the car. But what a counter argument could be, or one that I at least see and hear a lot, is that every investment is sort of painful at the beginning. The argument, by the way, is also made for solar and wind too, but so not only EVs, but they say that yes, it's going to be expensive at the beginning. The cars are going to be expensive at the beginning. The infrastructure is going to be, lumpy at the beginning and stuff like that. But Moore's law, that's pretty much the argument. Moore's law will make the technologies much cheaper over the long run. And the pain that you will go through today, that's an investment for your kids that they'll thank you for that, because you're going to have placed infrastructure, you're going to have invested in the technology that is going to improve that, and all that. So what do you think about that argument, Brian?
I don't think it holds water because the reality is these are not new technologies. These are actually old technologies. Electric vehicles were invented before the combustion engine,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So solar and wind, they've existed since the late 1800s, right? So we're not talking about brand new technologies that we just developed a decade ago. Yes, any commercialization process requires a ramp up, but these technologies are not new. That's one of the things. And then the second part is that Moore's law does not apply. That's a category error of thinking of applying something that had this exponential kind of increase in efficiency in terms of transistors and computer chips to something that doesn't even operate in the same way. Looking historically, battery efficiency has not been doubling every 18 months like Moore's law. You're seeing a few percentage points, maybe 5% increases in efficiency incrementally as you go. We need a breakthrough in battery chemistry to have any kind of radical increase in efficiency, in power density in the battery.
Mm.
Lithium ion batteries are great. I love them. They're very useful. They're in my phone
Yeah.
here, my computer, all kinds of things. I love them. But to think that we're going to run our whole energy system based upon them is just it's an inappropriate technology for the task. So you have to match the technology for the intended use. And right now, we don't have the battery capacity to do that. If we're talking about really scaling up electric vehicles and then grid storage, the other thing you mentioned was cost declines. Well, because a huge percentage of the cost in these technologies, whether you're talking about wind turbines, solar panels, or electric vehicles, is actually it's in the core minerals and components that go into it. It's a significant amount of the cost. That's why we're seeing the actual cost go up now that commodity inflation is happening. Everything's getting more expensive, right? It's more expensive to get things out of the ground, to put it on a boat, ship it around the world. Everything's getting more expensive. And the same is true of electric vehicle batteries and solar panels and wind turbines. Yes, they did decline for about a decade. We had a significant drop of over 80% declines in the cost of solar panels and wind turbines, and in batteries also declined. However, that is over. That drop is ended, and now we're going back up because of these inflationary pressures. And when we think about it, just from first principles, there's not enough mines existing or planned to basically meet the various goals that the governments have set using wind, solar, and electric vehicles to hit these climate reduction goals. So if we don't have the capacity that's here now, or even in the pipeline, and we know, according to the International Energy Agency, it takes about 16 years on average to bring a new mine online. So we're not talking about something you can just stand up in a few years, that we're short. And this is going to have a spillover effect because the amount of copper and nickel and all of these critical minerals that are needed in these technologies, well, it's not that they're just needed for that. We need copper to build a house, to plumb the house, right? We need copper in all kinds of industrial and manufacturing processes. So what we're going to see is this additional demand for these technologies is actually going to not only be inflationary for those products, so you're going to pay more for solar panels, pay more for wind turbines, but you're also going to pay more for everything else that uses that commodity because of the spillover effect, and
Mm.
it's basically gobbling up a bunch of the supply. So
Mm.
it's going to make other things more expensive as well, which is a serious concern.
It's a concern, but it also sounds to me, as a retail investor, it sounds to me like an opportunity. So, knowing all that we've sort of gone through here today, if you had to guess or put your money on something, what parts of the market do you expect to perform well as an investment going forward? Because you sound to me like you're a commodity bull, and specifically an energy commodity bull, but also base metals, industrial metals, battery metals. You're mentioning copper and all these things. We got tin and a lot of other metals that a lot of people are bullish on. What do you think?
So I see a lot of long-term investment potential in a lot of these commodities and specifically in the energy commodities. So I think long-term natural gas is going to be one of the biggest winners over the next decade. I think there it's just the world is such an essential element in almost every industry, whether we're talking about the food we eat and it's used in the fertilizer we grow, to various manufacturing and industrial processes to make all the products that we want, to actually burning it for electricity. So there's so many useful applications for natural gas, and we're structurally short. The world, like it or not, is going to get more efficient and cleaner, and we're going to have less pollution. And a lot of these policies that are pushing us in that direction are going to lead us to use more natural gas, because we're going to, even though we're using more coal in the moment in this kind of emergency spike, ultimately, I think we will continue to transition more and more to cleaner burning fuels. And natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel. Natural gas has 50% of the CO2 emissions is coal and 10% of the air pollutants. So it's a much cleaner burning fuel. And for all of those reasons, because it's has so many applications, because it's a cleaner burning fuel, because now that LNG transport has facilitated it to become a global commodity, not in the same way, it's not as fungible as a barrel of oil, but now it's much more able to be shipped around the world on all of these LNG tankers. So I think, and we have a structural supply shortage. So I'm long natural gas and LNG and the various liquid products that are associated with it, for sure. I also think, though, that oil is not going anywhere. I mean, 97% of the world's transportation relies on oil, right? So it's not you're not going to just flip that off overnight. Of course, over time, as we become more efficient, as we transition to more electric vehicles and other technologies that are consuming less of it, but we're going to need it for at least the foreseeable decades. And the developing world especially is going to need it. And that's where it's going to be, that's where all the growth is, right? So I don't see oil going anywhere in the near term. Obviously, there's a lot of volatility, and I'm not a short-term trader, so don't take anything I'm saying as investment advice about what's going to happen next week, in 2 days, or a month from now. I'm looking out, what are the overarching trends of these commodities over the next 3, 5+ years, and where are we structurally in these markets? And what I see is that we're going to be short a lot of these commodities and critical minerals, and specifically energy. And we're not going to just build our way out of this somehow with wind, solar, and electric vehicles. And even if we were going to, those require a tremendous amount of critical minerals, right? So I don't see any scenario where we're not going to need a lot to dig a lot of more stuff out of the ground.
I absolutely agree with you there. And there, to your point about oil, there were some rumors today actually that OPEC Plus will introduce a production cut of more than a million barrels a day, as they are worried about dropping demand over the near term. And a lot of people in the same time are calling for a way too high of an oil price, with oil now being at around $90. Because you said it's not going anywhere. I assume you're talking about the commodities not going away of our lives. But what about pricing? Do you think it's too expensive at where it's at right now?
Well, price is going to be volatile because we live in a very chaotic world. I mean, look at all of the geopolitical events that are happening that are way beyond any of our control to predict. I mean, who would have predicted that the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines would be blown up last week? That COVID happened, that Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, all of these geopolitical issues are almost impossible to predict, and they do have big impacts on the price, right? So again, that's why there's people much smarter than I am that are looking at this through the lens of the day and trying to arbitrage and try to kind of time the market of when they're getting in and out on any particular investment strategy. So I'm looking at that longer term view and just structurally where we're at, knowing there's going to be a lot of volatility. There's no way around it. We live in a very complicated, very chaotic world, and that's going to impact the price. I see us, though, structurally, it seems like where we're at today, for the price of oil is going to it's going to be volatile, but I don't see us dipping way down and staying there for any period of time. I think the trend line is going to continue to go up. We might see, given the economy right now, and there's softening and recession happening as demand drops. Obviously, that's a concern for the price, but that's not going to last forever, right? That is going to course correct, and a lot of that has been also forced by a lot of the shutdowns, the mandatory COVID shutdowns, et cetera, in China, and other aspects of kind of those policies.
Hmm. But so in conclusion, long term, we're not at peak oil, we're not at peak gas, none of these things.
I don't think anywhere close. I mean, I think we're going to use a lot more oil and gas in the coming decades. I don't think those commodities are going anywhere. If anything, we're going to be continue to rely on them because as we innovate, as we develop a whole new suite of technologies and products, all of these things are made from oil and gas. And again, as I said, I don't see this electrification trend. I think will continue, and we will start to electrify more of transport. But today, it's barely a drop in the bucket. It's like 97% of everything is transport in the world using fossil fuels, and you're not going to quickly transform big cargo ships and airplanes and all of these other kind of critical infrastructure pieces overnight to be electrified. I just don't see that happening. I mean, yes, I think we'll start to see the passenger vehicles and light trucks starting to move more in that direction. But we got a lot of things that are going to be using oil and gas for many decades to come.
Someone might bring up hydrogen at this point, and I was disillusioned with hydrogen because I was absolutely I let myself be convinced on hydrogen, and I believed in it for I guess for the time that I didn't really put enough time to research it, but I believed in it for a while back there. There were even some stocks that did really well in the hydrogen industry, but I've seen you disagreeing with hydrogen as well. What can you tell me about that?
Well, hydrogen is an incredibly useful and valuable molecule that we make all kinds of products out of it, right? It's used in the production of steel and in fertilizer, all kinds of things. So it's a very essential molecule, and we're going to continue to produce hydrogen. It's what is it being used for? So hydrogen is not an energy source. It's a carrier of energy.
It's a battery,
And
yeah.
yeah, it's like it's acting as that kind of battery or storage device. It doesn't create energy, right? And so it depends on what you're going to use it for. I think hydrogen makes a ton of sense in heavy in energy intensive industrial processes, whether you're going to be making steel or anything at very high temperature. If you want to burn hydrogen to help in that process, then great, that can help decarbonize those processes. But to think that we're going to start using it in all kinds of other applications in vehicles, or we're going to start shipping it around the world like we do LNG, just doesn't make any sense. I think the biggest fallacy about hydrogen is that somehow we're going to store excess renewable energy at the peak during the day when we're curtailing it. Right now, I had this tweet the other day, like Australia is on track that 20% of all of the solar power that they generate is going to be wasted or curtailed is the
Yeah.
technical term for this. And the vision of hydrogen from some of the people that hold this fantasy is, well, we're just going to, during those parts of the day where we have excess, we'll then use an electrolyzer and we'll create hydrogen out of it, right? And that is, but what they're not taking into account, the capacity factor of that electrolyzer is going to be terrible, right? You're going to be something that's like 3 to 5% of the time you're going to be using the electrolyzer because already renewables are, let's say solar, even in a sunny place, you're going to be basically making power 24% of the time. And then you have to say, well, you're only going to be using the excess, right? Because you want to use the solar for the grid or whatever application you're using it for. So now you're just taking the excess energy and making hydrogen out of it. Well, that electrolyzer has a terrible capacity factor. It's going to be so expensive to make that hydrogen. Generally, hydrogen is like 5 times more expensive already today. Right. So it depends on the application. So great for certain industrial applications. It makes no sense whatsoever as a device to store excess renewables and somehow cost effectively then use and transport that around the country, around the world.
That's pretty much what I found out as well, and it didn't take me that long. Somehow I was still pulled into the belief of, hey, this is going to work. Um, what about uranium? That's the largest part of my portfolio. How do you experience uranium as a, sort of an insider to the industry now working at Oklo? Um, we don't have enough supply. Price is not right. What do you think?
Well, I'm a uranium bull. I mean, one of the reasons I decided to go to work as head of business development for Oklo, which makes small modular reactors, is that I see just huge potential in the nuclear industry. I think we're starting to see the resurgence of the shift back to nuclear, and the very early days of what could be maybe a nuclear renaissance. We're seeing all these countries around the world doing about face, from Japan, UK, Korea, South Korea. We're starting to see the embracing of nuclear again, and that all has great signs for the price of uranium ultimately. And then small modular reactors, although they're going to take time to ramp up, I mean, I think we're going to start seeing quite a few in the field in the late 2020s. I think the 2030s, you're going to see a massive scaling of those technologies. And we're going to need a lot more uranium. It's just we're structurally, as we start embracing nuclear. I mean, my belief is nuclear power is inevitable, will be the dominant power source for civilization. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight because it takes a long time to build, and we have a lot of policy barriers today. But that is the overarching direction, and so uranium is the key ingredient to making that industry flourish and making it happen. So, I'm not a trader looking at next month, next week, or even next year. I'm looking several years out, but I see a lot of positive trend lines for uranium specifically due to this shift in this global kind of energy policy environment.
What happens to that embracing and that nuclear renaissance, though, if there are nuclear weapons being used, or if civil nuclear infrastructure like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant get used in a way to, let's just say they release radiation into the atmosphere for some reason? What happens to all these plants in the nuclear renaissance in that case?
Well, there's obviously geopolitical forces at work that can derail it. I mean, we've seen this happen before when Fukushima happened. So there's risk. I mean, any investment opportunity is going to have a risk profile, and certainly that is a one that's square in the middle of the uranium play, is that there is geopolitical risk. I mean, we don't, you have 400 plus plants operating around the country. If there's an accident, something happens, as you mentioned with Russia and the plant there in Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So there's no sure things, obviously, in this whole approach. But I think, barring that, and ultimately, I believe nuclear is one of the safest ways to make energy. So I'm not overly concerned about the risk profile. How the press perceives things and blows up these stories is a different matter. But it's certainly something that has to be factored in terms of the risk filter that people are using when they're getting into the space.
It's funny when you should mention the press, because of all the all the drama around the three biggest nuclear accidents that we've had: 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. What is it? One person died of direct radiation out of Fukushima, who was caveated by being a long-term smoker, and he died of lung cancer, maybe. And then 30 people died immediately from Chernobyl. Maybe there's some other numbers, 200 being mentioned and stuff like that. But then you have the gas pipe, the pipe leak into Danish, Swedish waters. How much is that releasing into the oceans, and what is the long-term effect of that going to be in terms of harm to human life relative to all the worst nuclear accidents that we've had? How much is the effect of that going to be? And also, if you combine that with what's been happening in Zaporizhzhia, a lot of people bring it up as, see, this is a problem for nuclear. And to me, though, it looks more as a big flashing advertisement for nuclear. I mean, a lot of bad things have happened around Zaporizhia. Landmines have exploded a couple of meters away from the reactors. Power was cut out, and then the backup generators sprung into action to help the staff connect back to the external power. All the plant has been under constant shelling almost all this time, and it kept producing energy until it was put into a cold shutdown. Ukraine even offered Germany to supply them energy for the winter, which is, I mean, I see this as a big advertisement for nuclear. I don't know what you think about all these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to energy security and national security is nuclear power. I mean, that is this war wouldn't even have really been enabled and possible um, if Russia didn't have a chokehold around natural gas. They supplied 40% of the natural gas in Europe, and a lot of the challenges right now are due to that policy. So if people had invested in nuclear power and had energy security and the freedom from not being reliant on an adversarial country, they wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. So I think that there's not only is it safe, but it's also from a national security and energy security perspective, a lot less risky to invest in that nuclear infrastructure.
Right, and I've already taken up a lot of your time today. I don't want to waste any more of that. What do you see in energy that you don't see too many people talking about? We've mentioned a lot of energy sources, different battery technology and stuff like that. What is something that people are not talking enough about?
I I think honestly, one of the most important things is the narrative in energy. I mean, there's the physical reality on the ground, and then there's how it is discussed in the policies that it shapes. And my fear right now is most around these fantasies that are now shaping energy policy, because they can have huge implications about what gets built, what doesn't get built, and where investment dollars flow. And so my number one focus outside of my day job is really helping to change the energy narrative, because unless we push back and fight back about a lot of this misinformation and bad policies, then we are really going to be in a place where the quality of life is going to decline. We're going to see a lot more chaos and conflict, and we need to do something about it. And all I hear when you're whether it's on social media or even in the mainstream news, cable networks, etc., is continued the energy transition, energy transition. It's all solar, wind, electric battery, and electric vehicles, and we're divesting from fossil fuels, and that this narrative is poisonous. It's terrible for our future, and if we're going to push back and do something about it, we need to change it. So that's something that I think is really important, and we can all play a role in that to basically call that out and try to share as much quality information as we can.
Ryan, this has been great. Thank you for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, thank you. And if people are curious, if they want to follow me on Twitter, they can find me at Brian Gitt, or I have a website where I publish long form articles at briangitt.com as well. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. There's going to be a link in the description of this video to Brian's Twitter account. He's been growing rapidly. He shares a lot of useful information, useful facts, despite the bad joke that I made at the beginning of this video. So I would definitely recommend a follow. It doesn't cost you anything, and the link is going to be in the description below. Brian, thank you.
Thank you.